let's talk about punctuation and closing quotation marks. There's a simple rule for this, but a lot of detail to consider. First of all, if this is an error, putting the comma or period outside of the closing quotation mark, what does that look like? So here is how it could look two different ways. And the one on the left, you'll notice that the period is outside. It's not tucked in here. It's tucked in all nice and neatly. And so this is the error. The incorrect one is when the period or the comma goes outside that quotation mark. We don't like that. We're very, very happy when it looks like this. So why does this matter? Ultimately, it matters because we are consistent and it is an American convention that we follow. Essentially, it's a rule, so we do it. Why is it a convention? It seems to be because that it looks a little bit neater. It is not a convention in all languages or with all publications, but standard American language puts it inside. And so why do we care about it? Is because all of your choices should be deliberate and purposeful when you're writing. And so you should be thinking about every choice that you make and making sure that you are following those rules. It's just an attention to detail thing. So let's take a look at the general guidelines. When you close a quotation, you're going to put commas and periods inside when you have ending dialogue, so when characters are speaking, when you're ending a quotation from an outside source, when you're ending a title that's in quotation marks, so that could be songs or articles or essays, or after a commonly used word or phrase that you put in quotation marks, like I did with commonly used there. So it's for all the different purposes that you might be using quotation marks, they all follow the same rule. Obviously, you're only going to put a period or comma inside the quotation marks if grammatically you need one there. Just because you have a closing quotation mark doesn't mean that you have to put a period or comma there. Please note that it is different if you're reading a British publication. They have a lot more complex but more logical rules potentially for these. But so if you see it done differently, it's probably because it's a British publication. So let's think through each of the different punctuation marks. A period, if you have a period and the end of a quotation, then you will always put it inside that closing quotation mark. Same thing with a comma. When we come to question marks and exclamation points, it's a little bit different. Sometimes, this one you have to think through. Is it part of the quoted material or is it my question mark or exclamation point? If you're writing academically, you should not have any of your own question marks or exclamation points because they involve the reader and are too emotional. So if you're writing academically, they should only exist in your paper inside of a quotation. If they're inside of a quotation, they're a-okay. If you're writing dialogue, though, you have to think about, is this the question that the character or person or quoted material is asking, or is it a question that I'm asking about that thing? And so if it's your question, then it goes outside. If it's their question, then it goes inside. Same thing for that exclamation point. Semicolons and colons essentially never go inside a closing quotation mark because if the quote if you're ending your quoted material with a colon or a quotation or a semicolon, you're going to drop that out because it indicates that something else is following. If you're not bringing in the following stuff, you're going to end there. And then you're going to decide if your punctuation is going to be a comma, a period, or if you're just continuing on with information. If you need a colon or a semicolon after the end of quoted material, then it's going to go outside of the quotation marks. So we'll take a look at how all of that works. If you have a parenthetical citation that comes after quoted material, then you're going to hold off on that period or that comma until after the citation, okay? So you will not have punctuation here, even though it is the end of your sentence, because the citation is still part of that sentence. So you're going to put the period here instead of here. If you had your keyword leading in, then your period would still go right there, tucked inside that quotation mark, nice and pretty. Another question comes up is if my title, so if I have here, this is an essay, or a short story, and if that includes a period, what do I do with that? And really, essentially, this title, I've always suspected cat person was based on my life. Now I know it was. So the title ends with a period. I can drop that period in order to make it flow with my writing. So here I've started a sentence anyway. In the Slate essay, I've always suspected cat person was based on my life. Now I know it was. Alex Nowicki argues that. So here, grammatically, because this is a clause at the beginning, I need a comma here. So I changed that period to a comma. If I didn't have a clause here and didn't grammatically need a comma to end this section, then I would just not have any punctuation at all right there, so that you don't have an internal period. You can have periods inside, like here, inside the overall quote, but when it ends a quote, it makes it feel like that's the end of your sentence, and then you end up with fragments. So you would change that to a comma or drop it. So let's take a look at some examples, some creative and academic examples from students, and a professional example, and how it looks when we see it, say, online or in a newspaper or magazine. So this is a short story with dialogue, and you will notice that this is how it looks whenever essentially, some authors will change it, but it'll be an overall change throughout the entire text, and usually for a purpose. But when we're talking dialogue, our periods and commas that end that dialogue go inside. So that's going to look the same, like I said, if you look in any of your novels or books that you're reading. So here's The Great Gatsby, and so she really ought to get away from him, resumed Catherine. And so that's going to end in a comma because the interjection follows that and is still part of that sentence. And then the period is always going to go inside, just like we did down here. When we're talking about a title that ends with a question mark, so this is a student example, and we're talking about an article called Should You Have to Do Community Service? And so we're going to keep that question mark because it's a really integral part of the title, just like an exclamation point would be. If I needed a comma physically here, often I can use the question mark as an internal pause, or I could add my own comma. Ask your teacher or professor what their preference is. That one does vary a little bit source to source. And so here's another one where the article title does not end with punctuation. And so therefore, because I grammatically need this title because it's a clause, I am going to tuck that comma right inside that ending quotation mark. Here is an odd spot. This happens to be in a literary analysis, a student example, where we have a semicolon and we have a parenthetical citation. So it gets a little bit complex, but we're going to treat that semicolon just like a period or a comma after that quotation. And since I have a citation, it has to follow. If there were a semicolon here, it wouldn't make any sense because it would mean that the quoted material needs to follow on with something else. So here, though, we have a quote that doesn't need a parenthetical citation because we lead in with the bright futures information. And so there's no page number on that source, so we don't have a parenthetical citation, and therefore the period goes inside those quotation marks, as it always does. You can see that professionals do it in American publications as well. This is an article from Slate, and that comma goes directly in there. There's a really fun article, if you can find it, from Slate about why this is actually the wrong way to do it, that Americans are wrong and the British are right, which is why I decided to go to Slate for this particular example. But you can see that that's what we do. So how are you going to find this one? It's actually pretty darned easy. If you hit the Command key along with the F key at the same time, that will pull up in the upper right-hand part of your window a find box. If you just type in your quotation mark there, it will pull up and highlight each of the quotation marks that you have in that document, and then you can evaluate each one. That's a beginning one, so it doesn't really matter. This one doesn't end with punctuation. It's after the citation, so it's good. This is beginning, and then I can check this one that there is a comma inside the quotation mark instead of outside. This is the most comprehensive way to check for it. If you just want to make sure that you don't have the error, you could add a comma right here and then a period right here just to see if you have any of the error, and only the error if you don't want to evaluate all of your quotation marks. How do you avoid this in the future? The first thing is really just to practice. The same way that you know how your fingers fall on the home row keys, just get used to knowing how it feels when you end a quotation and then have a period. Recognize that those pinky and ring finger motions are going to be wrong, and kind of remind yourself of that over and over again. Then you'll begin to start to feel it, that feels a little awkward. I need to step back and do something different. And you'll notice we start doing it differently. Then I will tell you that even though I know this rule and know it really well, because I'm thinking, okay, here's my quotation, I'm ending my quotation, then I need to go on to my thought, I will hit the end quotation mark and then I'll hit my comma or my period, and then I'll be like, oh, need to fix it. And so that's really where this first step comes in, is letting you know when you need to fix it. Often you aren't going to remember because you're not thinking ahead in your writing. You often will have to go back and fix it as you go. If it interrupts your flow, then you can use it as an editing step, and just make sure that it's always one of those things that you put on your own editing checklist if you know that it's something that you don't naturally do as you're going through.